Hi, Chad, Versamatic. Today we're going to install an air-in kit into our E1 metal non-metallic center pump. Out front we have examples of Versamatic genuine parts in the form of air-in kit and wet-in kit. The rebuild you're going to see is accurate and man-method to machine, but for video purposes some parts of the work performed have been condensed in time. At any part during the presentation, please pause this video until you have completed any part of the process. The pump we are using in this presentation has been built new and is considerably easier to work with than a pump that has been used in a process. Additional time may be required in the preparation and separation of components during the rebuild. Identifying which kit is required for your repair has become easier on newer pumps with the permanently affixed metal serial number tag that now indicates the wet end and air-in kit information for the pump. Kit information can also be found in the service and operating manual. Versamatic genuine replacement parts, wet end and air-in kits provide a bill of material of the components included in the kit. All items included in the kits are components that Versamatic recommends replacing when rebuilding a pump. The pump we are using today is an example of the ease of installation. Always consult your respective service and operating manual before performing any maintenance on your pump. Service and operating manuals include composite repair parts drawings, repair parts list, and torque specifications. The air-in rebuild you're going to see today will include the following items: inserts, O-rings, gaskets, and U-cup seals. These are the recommended tools used with the rebuild. While the sizes may change based on the model, the type will remain the same. Torque wrench, ratchet, small slotted screwdriver, O-ring pick, Phillips head screwdriver, sockets and or wrenches, 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch, 5/32 inch socket head Allen wrench. Alright, let's get started. For ease of disassembly, today we're going to use a 3/8 drive impact gun. First we're going to take off the discharge manifold. Set the discharge manifold aside for later rebuild. Remove the discharge check balls. Remove the discharge valve seats and valve seat O-rings. Remove the main air valve. Set aside main air valve for later rebuild. Now remove the suction manifold. Set aside the suction manifold for later rebuild. Now remove suction side valve seats and valve seat O-rings. And set aside for later rebuild. Remove suction check balls. Now remove one outer chamber. Set aside the outer chamber for later rebuild. Now remove the outer plate and the diaphragm assembly. Remove diaphragm, set aside outer plate for later reassembly. Set aside inner plate. Remove opposite outer chamber. Set aside the outer chamber for later rebuild. Pull the second diaphragm assembly out with the diaphragm rod. Now remove the valve retainer plate. Set aside the valve retainer plate for later rebuild. Now remove the main shaft O-ring and discard. Now remove the bumper O-ring on the pilot spool. Now we can push out the pilot spool from this side. Set aside pilot spool for later rebuild. Remove the opposite valve retainer and set aside for later rebuild. Remove the main shaft O-ring. Now we're going to remove the pilot sleeve. Here we're going to use a nut driver to simply push it through. Turn over the center section and remove by hand. Set aside the pilot sleeve. Now we're going to install our airing kit. Now begin to remove the pilot sleeve O-rings and discard. Inspect the pilot sleeve for any damage, scarring, or scratching and replace as needed. Now install the O-rings from the outside in. Apply light grease to the pilot sleeve O-rings and apply grease to the pilot sleeve bore. Grease is applied to keep the items from catching, binding, or cutting while assembling components. Be sure to press the pilot sleeve in by hand and bring it flush with the center section of the pump. Go ahead and put a little grease where the main shaft O-ring will sit. Repeat this process for the opposite side. Now install the main shaft O-ring on both sides. Now we're ready to install our valve retainer plate. Simply tighten the Phillips head screws flush to the valve retainer plate, bringing the valve retainer plate snug to the center section of the body. There is no torque value for these screws. Repeat this process for the second side. Now remove the old O-rings on the pilot spool. Inspect the pilot spool for any scarring, scratching, or damage. Now install the pilot spool O-rings starting from one end. Be sure to leave one of the bumper O-rings off. Apply light grease to all pilot spool O-rings. Install the end without the bumper O-ring first. Gently insert the pilot spool so you don't damage, nick any of the pilot spool O-rings. Once the pilot spool is installed, now we're ready to install our bumper O-ring on the opposite side. Be sure to seat all O-rings into each of the O-ring grooves on the pilot spool. Now we're ready to rebuild our air valve body. Now remove the retaining clip and set aside for later reassembly. Push the spool out to one side push the end cap out. Remove the end cap and set aside. Now begin to push the spool out completely. Remove the second end cap. Inspect the air valve body for any damage and replace as needed. Now remove the end cap sleeve O-rings. Remove the old O-ring on the end cap. Now remove the old U-cup seals for the main air valve spool. Inspect the spool for any damage or wear and replace as needed. First, we're going to install the larger U-cup seal. Be sure to install the U-cup seal with the cup portion facing in. Be sure to fully seat the U-cup seal in the groove on the spool. Now install the small U-cup seal with the U-cup portion facing in. Now install the end cap O-ring. Be sure to seat the O-ring into the groove. Install the O-rings on the end cap sleeve in the O-ring groove. Apply light grease to the main air valve body. Apply light grease to the end cap O-rings. Install one end cap, the larger one that is the sleeve, first. Be sure to fully seat the end cap sleeve. Now apply grease to the second end cap O-ring. Apply grease to the U-cup seals on the valve spool. Install the small end of the main air valve spool first into the main air valve body, and you'll want to compress the U-cup seal on the larger end and pressing it into the air valve body. When seating the end cap on the opposite side, be sure it's flush with the main air valve body. This will help ensure that the retaining clip can be installed properly. When installing the retaining clip, be sure it's fully seated into the main air valve body. Repeat this process for the opposite side. Now install our air diverter with the cup portion facing out towards the valve insert. Be sure to align all the bolt holes and the porting holes of the air valve gasket to the main air valve body. Apply a little grease to the diaphragm rod. This will ensure that we don't damage the main shaft O-ring upon installation. Inspect the outer chamber for casting integrity. Inspect the machine surfaces and radius of the chamber for damage or material buildup. Scarring, scratching, or material buildup can be cleaned up using emery paper, crocus cloth, or fine sandpaper. Chamber orientation requires the discharge side of the chamber to be installed in the same direction as the air valve face on the center block. Now we're ready to install and bolt down our outer chamber. Once we torque our outer chamber bolts, we're ready to install our second diaphragm assembly. Install the outer diaphragm plate. Install the radius of the inner diaphragm plate towards the diaphragm. Begin the hand tighten on the diaphragm assembly to the rod and torque to factory specifications. If the diaphragm assembly achieves torque before bolt holes are aligned, always go forward, never back off. Note the alignment of the bolt holes on the diaphragm and the center section of the pump. Inspect the opposite outer chamber. Inspect the radiuses. Note the orientation of the outer chamber in relation to the center section of the pump. Now we're ready to install our outer chamber bolts. Once all outer chamber bolts are installed, be sure to torque these outer chamber bolts to factory specifications. Now install our suction side check balls. Inspect the valve seats. Inspect the machine surfaces, the sealing surface. The step in the valve seat will face towards the suction manifold. This allows for an O-ring groove to install our valve seat O-rings. Be sure to fully seat the valve seat O-ring into the groove. Inspect the machine surfaces of the suction manifold. Inspect the casting integrity. Inspect the threads. Orientation of the manifold is based on process requirements and may be reinstalled in either direction. Now install the bolts for the suction manifold. Torque the bolts down in a cross pattern and torque to factory specifications. Now we're ready to install our main air valve. Note the alignment of the air valve, the port holes and the bolt holes to the center section of the pump. Be sure to torque the main air valve to the center section to factory specification. Now we're ready to install our discharge valve seats. Note the step in the valve seat. Inspect the machine surfaces of the valve seat. Install the step of the valve seat towards the discharge manifold. Be sure to fully seat the valve seat O-ring into this groove. Now we're ready to install our discharge check balls and our discharge manifold. Inspect the discharge manifold machine surfaces. Ensure that we have a good sealing surface. Inspect the integrity of the casting. Inspect the threads. Inspect the ball cages for any sharp edges. These ball cages can be addressed with light sandpaper or replace as needed. Orientation of the manifold is based on process requirements and may be reinstalled in either direction. Now we're ready to bolt down our discharge manifold and torque to factory specification in a cross pattern.